Mr.Gelder. This Millenium Film is a representation of the ongoing political, economic, and social trials and tribulations that Canada has undergone. Courage, unity, togetherness, and trust are the fundamental basics of national culture. Each historical event was critical to the formation of Canada's identity. Furthermore, I ask you to take great pleasure in this classic and contemporary storyboard of Canada. This is Canada's history in photographs, 1914 to 1919. Vimy Ridge was a battle of valor and bravery, not only for Canadian forces, but also for Britain and France. Led by Arthur Currie, Canadians strengthened their defenses by carrying out increasingly frequent raids on enemy trenches, military mining, subway systems, communication centers, and deep caverns. On April 9, 1917, all 4 Canadian divisions led the assault, and by April 10th they had captured the German fortified Hill 145, which had well-wired trenches and deep dugouts. Canada owed this victory to sound and meticulous planning, fighting tactics, and thorough preparation that minimized casualties. Finally, it was Brigadier General Alexander Ross who said, "It was Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, on parade." I thought then that in those few minutes I witnessed the birth of a nation. 1920 to 1929. In the early 1920s, women went from homebound producers to wage-earning consumers, active, independent, and productive in their newfound roles. Hemlines went up, formalities were abolished as women embraced their sexuality. Modesty and subservience dissolved from the status quo. This was especially noted in Canada on May 24, 1918, when women were granted the right to vote in federal elections. Hence, Agnes MacPhail was elected as the first female member of Parliament. Women still had to challenge legal and political equality, though, but in 1929, women were identified as persons under the Canadian Constitution. Global expansion brought reform-minded women to the front of society. As Catherine Schuyler writes, thus although their own communities were essential to their social strength, women were able to realize the full potential of their collective power by reaching outside those boundaries. 1930 to 1938. The Great Depression between 1929 and 1933 hit Canada hard, where the gross national product dropped 40% and unemployment skyrocketed to 27%. Businesses closed as corporate profits evolved into losses. Canadian exports shrank by 50%. Construction stopped, wholesale prices dropped, and wheat prices plunged. The most affected areas were dependent primary industries, including farming, mining, and logging. Most families saw assets disappear and endured severe hardship. Factories reduced work weeks due to lack of consumer demand. People were laid off, and wages fell. The Depression originated in the United States, but with close economic links, the collapse quickly affected Canada. The prairies and Maritimes, along with Ontario and Quebec industries, were also hit. Moreover, there was a rise in working-class militancy. Fortunately, Canada did have a stable banking system. Due to the slow recovery of the Canadian economy, it took the outbreak of World War II to pull Canada out of the Depression. 1939 to 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic. Determined to destroy British sea communications and overseas supplies, German soldiers cut off all lifelines. However, the principal contender, the Royal Canadian Navy, carried out demolitions, protected the southwestern approaches to Britain, strove to fend off submarine attacks, rescued survivors of torpedoed merchant ships, and controlled ship movements. It was dangerous work, and Canadians shared in the worst hardships experienced in the war at sea. Canada's shipping fleet was revolutionized with the development of corvettes, also known as wet ships, and Canada was made responsible for the Newfoundland bases. After the Atlantic Battle, the Culminating Conference in March 1943 determined Britain and Canada would share responsibility for the Atlantic. This permitted Allied shipping lanes to remain open. Hence, at the end of hostilities, the Canadian Navy had obtained 373 fighting ships, 90,000 men, and 6 destroyers. 1946 to 1959. Communism's initial aim was to achieve the greatest good for the most people, done through equitable distribution of goods and services. However, communist countries discovered there was a great deal of work involved with little return. Igor Gozinski, a separate clerk from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, indicated the existence of Soviet spies operating in Canada. Moreover, Canada and the Soviet Union were allies in the war against Germany and Japan. With widespread fear of continued communist expansion by violent means, Western Europe and Canada formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. In addition, Canada constructed early radar warning stations, assuming that if the Soviets attacked the United States, they would fly over the North Pole. The North Pole was equipped with 3 lines of defense, including the Distant Early Warning Radar Signs, or DEW, to detect and disarm Soviet aircrafts. For further protection, Canada and the United States formed the North American Air Defense Comrade, or NORAD. 1960 to 1967. The purpose of a nation's flag is to send a message of unity, togetherness, and nationality. Canada has been an independent country since July 1, 1867, or Confederation, when it separated from the British Dominion, but in the early 1960s, its flag was still derived from the British Union Jack. Despite including the Canadian coat of arms, it represented historical alliances and British roots. In 1964, John Matheson headed a committee to find a new flag for Canada. The House of Commons and the Senate met 46 times, listening to historians and more than 2,000 Canadian proposals. The group narrowed it down to the red ensign combined with a fleur-de-lis and Union Jack, 3 maple leaves with blue borders, and a red flag with a single maple leaf in a white square. Veterans opposed the suggestion because the Union Jack was the one and only flag they had fought under, whereby citizens appreciated the new identity. Finally, after the acrimonious debate, Canada accepted the single maple leaf with 2 red stripes. 1968 to 1999. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a Bill of Rights that guarantees certain political rights to Canadian citizens and civil or societal rights of everyone in Canada. It was signed into law by Queen Elizabeth II on April 17, 1982. Any legal person can exercise the rights under limitation. The rights are enforceable by the courts and are binding on the federal government. In addition, the Charter was intended to be a source of national values and unity. Moreover, the Supreme Court of Canada stated the Charter is a part of the Constitution of a nation, part of the fabric of Canadian law, the supreme law of Canada. I hope you duly appreciated the history of Canada's past.